The Centre presents a new podcast, CBME and You, a podcast devoted to promoting awareness and debate around controversial ethical issues in biomedicine.
Welcome to the final episode of CBME and You for 2024. To conclude our premiere season, we have Professor Peter Singer, visiting professor here at the National University of Singapore to the Centre for Biomedical Ethics, to answer some questions about philosophy, his life and legacy, and thoughts on cancel culture, which Julian is most excited about. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, good to be with you.
Thank you. So to begin the pod, we have some questions for you, which we ask all of our guests. First, coffee or copy?
Well, I don't drink either of them because, unfortunately, coffee gives me migraines. So
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, well, I can cope. But,
that's fair.
That's one thing I had to give up when I realised there was that connection.
I think for myself and other people, it's the other way around. Coffee helps with migraines. So it's very interesting that's the way it works.
I think there's quite a few people that it actually is a trigger for.
Next question. Which country would you like to travel to the most?
I've been to Nepal twice. I love mountains, and of course the mountains there are incredibly impressive. I was there in 1969 the first time, and then I was there in the mid-80s, hiking both times. I'd love to go back.
I'm sure that's why you were drawn to Singapore. We have all the mountains here.
Absolutely, yes, that's right. And that fresh, cool air that you get from the mountains.
Crisp. It really matches those beach mornings back home. And final question, my favourite. What song would you sing at karaoke?
Well, I should warn you first that I sing very badly,
so you
probably don't want to be there. But how about Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow?
Who's that by?
The Shirelles is the version that I know. It's, I don't remember.
Can you have a go now?
Please.
No, I will not have a go. Actually, Carole King composed it, I think.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. I do not know this one. I'll have a listen to it after.
You should definitely listen to it.
All
And
right.
go for the Shirelles version, though. There are others. But
All right. Before I pick up Practical Ethics again, I'll listen to this song.
absolutely, more important.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter. So thanks very much for coming on the podcast. You've been described as the world's greatest living philosopher. So can you tell us, what does a philosopher do?
Yeah, first a small correction. I think most influential was the phrase, which is a bit different from greatest.
Oh, okay.
And maybe there's some basis, at least most influential living philosopher anyway, there's some basis for that because very few philosophers are influential at all. But greatest I'm certainly not going to claim. What do philosophers do? They think about issues that can't really be resolved by running experiments, basically. So we think hard about questions like how ought I to live, what are the criteria for an action being the right action or the action that you ought to do. That's within the field of ethics. And then you can take that down to more applied and practical levels, like is it okay for me to eat meat? What should I be doing with my spare money, given that I live in a world in which there are lots of people who are in extreme poverty? And, of course, specific questions in bioethics, like is it okay for my physician to help me to die if I'm terminally ill and ask for them to do that? So you can see that those questions can't really be resolved just by gathering more information. You have to think them through, and that's what we philosophers spend our time doing.
But I guess a lot of people will say it's really up to the individual, or the society. So isn't this just your opinion of what they should do rather than theirs? I mean, how do you get to think about those things in a way that is different from how we think about them?
Well, I think most philosophers would agree that reason can play some role, that it's not just your opinion in the sense that anyone's opinion is as good as anyone else's. It might be that when you get down to the most fundamental questions, it's very difficult to decide between fundamentally different ethical views. But especially at the applied level, there are many people who hold views that turn out to be ones that have implications that they can't accept. So there's clearly a problem going on there. They say one thing like, I think all human life is of equal value, but then they don't act in accord with that if a baby is born with anencephaly, which is a condition where there's really no cortex, so the baby will never be conscious or smile at their parents or do anything. And it's difficult to see that life is of equal value to that of other humans who can do all those things and can have rich and fulfilling lives. So one of the things that we do is we try to look at the implications of different views and see which of them are most defensible in those terms. But we can also try and reason about the foundations, and we do that, even if we don't always get complete agreement in the views that we hold.
Okay, great. We'll come back to some of your thoughts about different ethical issues, but just you corrected me. You're the most influential living philosopher, but perhaps not the greatest philosopher ever. Who is your favourite philosopher?
Well, my favourite philosopher of the period that I've been involved in philosophy, sadly, is no longer alive, but it was until a few years ago, and that's Derek Parfit, who was a philosopher in Oxford when I went there as a graduate student in 1969, and the seminars that he and Jonathan Glover and Jim Griffin gave about ethics, just starting to do interesting issues in applied ethics, which wasn't really very much done before, was really exciting. And he wrote a fascinating book called Reasons and Persons, published in 1984. And then he started working on this question of the objectivity of ethics, and wrote what was originally two large volumes called On What Matters, and then there was a third volume published just around the time he died. But in conversations with him, I always felt I always had the feeling that here was somebody who was thinking ahead of me. It was a bit like me and a very amateur chess player playing against the grandmaster, and that whatever move you come up with, they've already thought of it, and they've already thought of how to reply, and they've thought of how you might reply to their reply, and so on. So talking to Derek was a little bit like that.
Yes, he was a very impressive man. I wonder, while we're still on the sort of philosophy and the sort of the kind of contributions to philosophy, what do you hope that your legacy will be in the future? What do you hope you'll be remembered for?
I hope I'll be remembered for having put some challenging views out there that have had a practical impact, that have changed the way people have lived. Maybe they've changed what people have eaten. Maybe they've changed what people have done with their spare cash. And they've done that in ways that were positive, not only for, let's say, for reducing the suffering of animals or assisting people in extreme poverty, but also for the person themselves who changed their views. That is, that their lives became more rewarding, more fulfilling, because they now had an ethical purpose that maybe they didn't have before.
What do you think your most controversial idea has been?
Probably, well, there's a couple of candidates for that, really. One of them is my views about the permissibility of euthanasia for severely disabled newborn infants. That is, that parents should have the option of euthanasia, not that anybody else should perform it without the parents expressing their request for it, but that if parents did think that that was best, after discussing that with those who know about the disability and with the doctors, that they should be able to have that. So that's been controversial and has caused some protests against some of the things that has caused some protests when I've been speaking in some countries.
So in these cases, you believe that well-being would be maximised by, in one case, performing infanticide for a severely suffering baby, experiencing pain for. Is that the idea?
Yes, that's the idea. In the case of the suffering infant, particularly a suffering infant where there is no prospect that this condition can be cured and that eventually we will get a child and later an adult who can have an enjoyable life, which will make up for the fact that they had to suffer for some time after birth. That's not an unusual situation. But if there is suffering and if there is no prospect of the life becoming one that is positive quality, plus, of course, it may be very distressing for the parents to have to look after this child, and in some cases it's inevitable that the child will die within months or at the most a couple of years, but the child has to be cared for during that period, and maybe that detracts from the care they can give to their existing children. So I think it may be better all round, both for the child and for the parents, that the child not live. And in fact, decisions are being taken and can be taken in neonatal intensive care units all over the world to ensure that the child doesn't live, but they're taken by non-treatment rather than by active assistance in dying. And non-treatment might mean such things as withdrawing the respirator if the child needs a respirator to breathe, in which case the child will struggle for breath for some hours before eventually dying. And, what's the point of that struggling and gasping for breath for a few hours? And in other cases, this is actually the circumstance that first brought this issue to my attention when I was directing the Centre for Human Bioethics at Monash University. We were visited by the director of the neonatal intensive care unit at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, Neil Campbell. And he told us of cases where babies born with severe spina bifida where the parents and doctors thought it was better that the child not live. But the child didn't need a respirator, so what they did was not close the wound on the back. Babies with spina bifida have an open wound at the back with damage to the spinal cord. They would not close the wound, so the baby would get an infection because, lying there with an open wound, they get an infection, and then you don't treat the infection either. So the baby, goes through certainly days and sometimes weeks of struggling with that infection before dying. And again, you've made a decision that it's better that the baby should die, and that's why you didn't surgically close the wound or treat the infection. But what's the point of letting the baby go through that suffering before dying when you could give an injection that the baby would fall asleep and die without any further suffering?
Well, those are very sad cases, and it's important to remember that I think Peter is discussing very severe cases like this, or another one you had in your book, Should the Baby Live, was epidermolysis bullosa, or severe cases where the baby's skin peels off and they're in constant pain and suffer serious infections, and there's no treatment. Utilitarianism, was a radical theory when Jeremy Bentham first introduced it. For the first time, everyone's well-being or happiness counted equally. The pauper's happiness counted as equally as much as the prince's, and he said each is to count for one and none for more than one. So many people don't realise, but utilitarianism has a very strong focus on the equality of everyone's happiness and well-being, and that's what matters, how happy or well-being people are, how happy or well-off they are.
In practical ethics, you differentiate between hedonistic utilitarianism and preference utilitarianism. For our audience, would you mind distinguishing which one you prefer and why?
Right. So I've already said, hedonistic utilitarianism is concerned with maximising the surplus of pleasure over pain or happiness over misery. Preference utilitarianism is concerned with maximising the satisfaction of preferences over the thwarting or frustrating of preferences. And in some versions, when you say satisfaction and frustration or thwarting, that sounds like a mental state, I'm feeling great, I'm really, really satisfied my preferences, or I'm so frustrated, I can't satisfy my preferences. But the pure preference utilitarian is not just talking about those mental states. They're talking about the fact that the preference is satisfied, whether or not it gives me a feeling of satisfaction, and maybe even in some cases I never know it, right? So there's some discussions, for example, about, you're a huge supporter of, I know you're an Australian background, so let's say, as I am, I'm a supporter of Hawthorn in the Australian Football League. So suppose that I'm really hoping that Hawthorn will win the premiership this season, but I'm away where there's no contact with the rest of the world. I'm on, a hike somewhere in a remote area, and Hawthorn do win the premiership, but sadly I die before I ever get back to civilization, and I never find out. Still, my preference was satisfied, and that's a sort of peculiarity of preference utilitarianism, that it sort of floats between this idea that, well, it's almost like hedonistic utilitarianism because it's talking about satisfaction being a good thing and frustration and thwarting being a bad thing, or you say, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about that what you preferred did actually happen. So the state of affairs occurred that you preferred, and that's a good thing. So one of them risks becoming just another sort of form of preference just another form of hedonistic utilitarianism, and the other becomes somewhat implausible. How did my life go better because my football team won the premiership, but I never knew about it? That seems odd. So in practical ethics, as you say, I distinguish between these two, and there's a story in that, because when I wrote Practical Ethics originally in 1979 was the first edition, I was a preference utilitarian. I'd been influenced by my teacher and professor at Oxford, R.M. Hare, who defended a form of preference utilitarianism. And I guess I was also influenced by the fact that it seemed like it was sort of value neutral in a way. It was just saying, well, whatever your preferences are, that's what's good for you, and I'm not imposing on you this idea that somehow what's good for you is your happiness and the absence of suffering. But then by the time it came to the third edition, which was 2011, I was starting to think that was mistaken, but I hadn't fully made up my mind. So the third, still the current edition, is a little bit ambivalent on that question, and does talk a bit more about hedonistic utilitarianism, which by the time I published The Point of View of the Universe, a book co-authored with Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek, I had actually abandoned preference utilitarianism and accepted hedonistic utilitarianism, which is still the position that I hold now.
Yeah, I think one of the very admirable things about you is your views have evolved over the years, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the other changes in your views. But you mentioned R.M. Hare, who was a famous, utilitarian. And I remember this funny story about Hare, and I wonder what your response to this is, because I was mentioning the radical implications of utilitarianism, and one of the radical implications of utilitarianism is we should give as much consideration to strangers, people we don't know, to their well-being as we should to our own children. And apparently Hare was once in a debate with another English philosopher who was an anti-utilitarian, Bernard Williams, who you'd also know. And they were having a television debate, and Williams turned to Hare and said, imagine a plane is crashing, it's crashed and it's going down, and you have only time to rescue your child or two strangers' children. Which one are you going to choose? And Hare was apparently flabbergasted by this question. But so I wonder what you think about the Williams's challenge. Would you rescue the two strangers or your own child?
Well, if you're asking, would I rescue my own
what
child
do you think
or the
the
two
right thing to
strangers?
do
Yeah,
is?
they're different things, right?
Well,
I
maybe
probably
not.
would rescue my own child, but I would not really think that I'd done the right thing. I think looking at it, as you say, impartially, if there's nothing else I know about the other children, and I have no reason to think that they are going to have less good, worthwhile lives than my own child, or that they're loved any less by their parents than my own children are loved, I would think that I would have done more good if I'd saved two children. At the same time, I wouldn't really think that I was blameworthy for saving my own child, because after all, it's good that children are brought up in loving families. I think there's no better way being shown to bring up children who are going to have happy and healthy lives than to bring them up in loving families. And if you do let parents follow their natural instinct and love their children, then of course in those situations they're going to save their child. So that's gets back to Parfitt. I think he had the term blameless wrongdoing for this kind of situation. And I think we need to keep those things separate. What would really be the right thing to do, or what was the wrong thing, and what would you blame somebody for doing?
I guess this sometimes called the over-demandingness objection to utilitarianism. It makes life extremely demanding that every day we're doing so many wrong things, especially if we accept the utilitarian idea that our omissions are, just as we're equally responsible for the consequences of our omissions as we are for our actions. And you've been famous for arguing that we have much greater obligations to people throughout the world, particularly those in the developing world, to give money and other goods to increase their well-being. And if you think about how much we spend each day, that could go to be saving very large numbers of lives. There is a huge gap between what we do and what we should be doing. Would you like to tell us, your ideas around how much we should be doing then for others?
Well, it's difficult to say exactly where that line is to be drawn. In the first piece I wrote on this, Famine, Affluence and Morality, published in 1972, I suggested that ultimately the only place to draw a line would be the point at which, if you gave away more, you would be reducing your own well-being by as much as you were raising the well-being of somebody else. And in one sense, I think that that's right. But there's also this question that I just mentioned about what you ought to be blamed for. And I think if you're giving it a significantly higher level than most people in your community, the higher level than most of your peers, then even if you're giving much less than that level that I just mentioned, you shouldn't be blamed, because what you're trying to do is, or what you are in fact doing, is raising the standard in your community. And if you're encouraging others to raise their standard, that may be the best thing that you can do. It may be that if you go around telling everybody, hey, you should impoverish yourself to the point at which if you impoverished yourself any further, you'd be worse off than the poorest person that you can find to help. People would, just throw up their hands and say, well, if that's what morality demands, I'm just going to give up on morality. It's too demanding. So what I've done in my more recent writing, in particular in the book The Life You Can Save, is to set out a scale. It's a progressive scale like income tax, so that the more you earn, the more you give, and the larger the percentage that you give, as well as the larger absolute sum, and suggested that people might like to follow that scale. And it's a scale which starts off quite low for people who are not well off, maybe at 1% of their income, and it increases then gradually until, for people who are really well off, it's suggesting they give away a third of their income. But these are people who can live very good lives on 2/3 of their income. They're living, in fact, on far more than most people in the community. So I think that, what we need to try to do is to develop social standards that are realistic, that people can follow, and that can raise the amount that is being given, while still making a big difference to people in need. And when you look at the amount that could be given without any real hardship, I think perhaps we would come close to eliminating extreme poverty without really affluent people themselves being all that seriously negatively affected by what they're giving. And arguably, as some of the people who've read The Life You Can Save have told me, they are actually better off. They might be poorer financially, have somewhat less wealth, but they have a purpose, and they find their lives more rewarding because they know about the good that they're doing.
Yeah, one of the features of utilitarianism is it's very dependent on what the facts are. particularly facts about people's psychology and behaviour. So you've made this claim, which has seemed quite plausible. I know you give a lot of your own personal wealth to charities, but you've made this claim that if we set the bar too high, close to this ideal standard of giving away as much until it's start to affect your own well-being to a greater degree, it's likely to put off people. But you and I both know young people, A.B. Rowerig, Josh Morrison, people in One Day Sooner have given a kidney to a stranger. And, this is something that, you might say, well, if we go around telling people that they should be giving a kidney to strangers, it's just going to put them off and they're not going to do anything. But in fact, A.B. Rowerig's personal story was that initially his mother was shocked and very angry and tried to do everything she could to stop him from donating a kidney to a stranger. And then after he explained it and had donated the kidney and she knew the family, she then decided to donate a kidney. And now she's actually campaigning for the payment of live donors for organs for other people. So, empirically, it doesn't seem to me that people going around donating kidneys and arguing that we should is putting people off. So I know you haven't donated a kidney, but maybe, that would be something, that level of sacrifice might not be something that puts people off, rather it encourages them. So how do you make this decision about what level of sacrifice is going to be, off-putting or encouraging?
As you say, utilitarianism is a view that is very sensitive to the facts of the situation. And I see that as a plus. I mean, there are some people who think, no, you must have a moral principle that says, do not tell a lie, never, ever, no matter what the circumstances. And I just think that that's wrong. And, clearly that gets you into various situations that you should not be getting yourself into. And with negative effects for sometimes many other people. So it's a good thing, but sometimes the facts are pretty difficult to work out, I agree. I'm not trying to produce a justification for myself in not donating a kidney. I don't have any such moral defence. I think I probably should have. Maybe I should have done it many years ago when it would have been a younger and healthier kidney, perhaps. Not that there's anything really wrong with my kidneys as far as I know, but certainly would have been a younger kidney than it is now. So I greatly admire people like A.B. Rowerig and Josh Morrison and a few others I know. There's a guy called Chris Croy who wrote to me after he donated it, and his decision actually started in an ethics class, which is quite interesting about the effect that ethics classes have on people. The class was reading Famine, Affluence and Morality, and somebody objected to the argument that if that argument is true, then surely, you have two kidneys, you can save somebody's life with one, surely you ought to give one. And Chris sort of bit the bullet on the objection. It took him a while, some months to think it through. But eventually he said, yes, that's right, I should. So I admire people who do that. But it's true. Maybe I'm just a coward about going into hospital and getting my body cut open to donate a kidney. I think it's quite possible that it would be good to encourage more people to do that. I've noticed that the number of altruistic kidney donors, donors to strangers, has been rising a little bit. So maybe that's becoming more widely accepted now.
Do you think that there's a difference between what morality expects of us and what makes us a hero? And morality doesn't expect us to be heroes, but even if it might be good to do so.
Yes, except that the phrase, what morality expects is a phrase that's a little difficult to work out because morality isn't a thing with expectations. So you could say what morality requires, and then you would be introducing a distinction between, if you like, what is obligatory and what is supererogatory. That is, so some things are obligatory, and then other things they're good to do, but then not obligatory. It's not wrong not to do. But as a utilitarian, I can't really accept that distinction, and I think it is more a matter of what should you be blamed for not doing. That comes close to what the obligation supererogation distinction is, but it's not exactly that. And especially where there's something like donating to charity, where you can do a great deal of good at quite a small cost to yourself, or as I said, maybe even zero cost, I think you ought to do it. So that's why I don't think that line is really one that can be drawn.
So you don't accept an asymmetry between like harms and benefits?
No, not really. Again, there's questions about how much harm are you doing, how much benefiting are you doing, but it's a continuum. So I don't accept.
So Philippa Foot had this famous example that there is a difference between failing to send money to save a child's life in a developing country to sending a poisoned food parcel to a starving child and killing them. So I'm not supporting this, but it is there is the view that many people hold that, harming is worse than failing to benefit.
Yeah, because if you think about that case, you're obviously influenced by the motivation, right? The failing to benefit is, this person, wanted to spend the money on something that themselves, I don't know, they wanted to get the latest iPhone, so they didn't send them, even though they had a perfectly good working phone, so they didn't send the money to somebody else, and so a child died. That's one thing. And we sort of, kind of to some extent, empathise with that motivation because we feel it ourselves, and as I say, none of us are saints, so we all do that to some extent. And on the other hand, there's a person who went to the trouble of getting a poison, putting it into this food package in a way that presumably would be disguised so nobody would notice, and then sending it over to these people who would eat it. And that's completely different motivation.
Yeah, but motivation is irrelevant to utilitarians. The outcome is the same in both cases.
But the outcome is the same. So, you could say both acts do equal harm. Let's say there's one child dead because I didn't send the money to the effective aid organisation, and there's one child dead because I did send the poisoned food package. But when Foot or somebody describes that case, what we think of is what kind of a person would do that. We don't just sort of push all that aside and say, okay, think about the objective outcome. The objective outcomes are equally bad. We tend to think, this is a terrible person, this is somebody I want to condemn, this is somebody who ought to be punished in the one case, and in the other case, this person's a bit like me, really. Lots of people are like that. So I don't have that kind of negative view. So really, I am sort of biting the bullet. I'm saying they are both equally bad in terms of objective outcome. I'm just saying that there are all of these other factors about motivation, about condemning the agent.
I just want to sort of push that another very famous counterintuitive implication for some is that utilitarianism justifies the killing of one individual to save a greater number. Famous trolley-style cases where you push an individual in front of a train to stop it to save 5 other lives. But perhaps the most famous example of this is the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed more than 100,000 people in order to supposedly save greater numbers of lives. So in these kinds of cases where the intention is to kill innocent individuals, as in the case of the US bombings, are you saying that those sorts of motivations and character don't count? Are those acts justified by does the end justify the means?
Well, as you said, utilitarians want to know all of the relevant facts. And in this case, they want to know things like, was there any other way to persuade the Japanese to surrender? Once the United States had this weapon and had tested it, was there a way to convince the Japanese that they had to surrender, otherwise it would be used? And there was discussions about performing a demonstration that the Japanese could actually witness to see the devastating power of this weapon. That was one question. Another question was it necessary to drop the bomb on Nagasaki? Japan might have surrendered. There's some historians, I think, debate whether how far that process had gone in terms of what Japan was ready to do, or what the Japanese government was ready to do after the destruction of Hiroshima had sunk in. So maybe that one was justified and Nagasaki was not. That's possible. The other question is, was there any other way to induce the Japanese to surrender, or would it have been necessary to invade the Japanese home islands and fight all the way up, which no doubt would have led to widespread killing? And of course, there was enormous deaths from the conventional bombing of Tokyo and other Japanese cities before the Americans had the nuclear bomb. So I think all of those questions need to be asked, and it seems from my reading of the history that they weren't really asked in a way that placed value on Japanese lives, on the lives of particularly of civilian Japanese. They were asked in terms of how many American lives would be lost if we had to fight this, much more than how many total lives would be lost. And so I'm not saying that the decision was justified, but there is a possible justification if various steps had been taken and if the facts had come out in a way that said this is the only way to minimise overall loss of life.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask me what your most controversial idea is, I mean, I'm biased, but I think your view that human lives differ in value is extremely controversial to people who want to hold that all human life has dignity and is of equal moral worth. And perhaps the most extreme example of that is, I think you've argued that human beings born with anencephaly could be experimented on. We could take their organs for transplantation, because in your view, that human life has no worth because it's unconscious. So killing that individual would not be wrong, and benefiting from the death of that individual would not be wrong. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Again, just so that our audience are clear, we're talking about a child who's undoubtedly a living human being, but who is missing all of the cortex and who will not be a conscious being, will not be able to enjoy anything, and conversely will not be able to suffer. So I don't think there's any need to keep that baby alive, and in fact, except for a very small number of cases of people with very strong religious convictions, anencephalic babies, well, usually they don't come to term because it's detected during pregnancy and the pregnant woman elects to terminate the pregnancy. But if they do, then nothing is done to resuscitate them, and they do die reasonably soon. But there was one case that I talk about where a woman or a couple actually in Florida wanted something good to emerge from the tragedy of their baby being born with anencephaly, and they asked the court to make the baby's heart available to be taken while still beating out of the baby and donated to another child who needed a heart, and that would have saved a life, because it's quite difficult to, where there's a baby born with a heart defect who needs a heart transplant, it's very rare to have an infant-sized heart available. But the court said no, and I can't really see a moral justification for saying no. I can see a legal justification, perhaps, in the way the law stands at present. But I don't actually think that is such a controversial implication. It is maybe for people who are just committed to this idea that all life is of equal value. But, Julian, I wouldn't have thought you would hold that view.
No, I don't. But I think many people would. And you can extend this argument because, of course, it's not just anencephalics who become unconscious. For example, the endpoint of dementia is unconsciousness. So as people become severely demented, if we extended your argument, and one of the things that's always impressed me is this sort of razor-sharp white light of your logic, is that individuals who have become unconscious with dementia or through trauma could be experimented on or have their organs taken.
Yes, that's true. There is one difference, and that is that they, having been normal conscious individuals, could express a view about that while they were conscious and in possession of their faculties, whereas an infant born without consciousness, of course, can never do that. But I would certainly think it would be a reasonable thing to get people to, or to make available to people, a document that they could sign if they wished, saying that if they ever irreversibly lost consciousness, they would not mind being experimented on or having their organs removed. I'd be quite happy to sign such a document.
But as a hedonistic utilitarian, why would we need such a document? At that point, they have no experiences. So
They have no preferences once they're dead.
So is it because you're worried that people will become anxious at the thought that this might happen to them?
People might not like living with the thought that, I'm going to be cut up. And some people, of course, may worry that the test will not be properly performed, or that they somehow will be.
But again, you have to weigh that against all of the lives that you could save. Maybe they will be distressed, but for example, if we introduced organ conscription rather than just opt-out organ schemes, there may well be people that are distressed, but there may well be many more people whose lives are saved. So from a utilitarian perspective, isn't it just a matter of weighing up those?
Well, it's a matter of seeing how that would play out. But if you had a culture that accepted organ conscription, this is like John Harris's idea of the organ lottery, right? That you all go into this lottery, and when organs are needed, and there aren't enough, from deceased donors or voluntary donors, you draw a ticket in the lottery, and somebody is chosen as the donor, and they get carved up, and their organs help 5 people live. So, given that you could be one of the 5 people, that would also maximise your chances of survival. But nobody has wanted to take that up because people think that people wouldn't trust the lottery, or they just don't like the idea. So I think.
But do you see nothing intrinsically wrong?
No, I see nothing intrinsically wrong with it. I just see the likelihood of strong resistance if you try to do it in societies at the moment. But maybe one day people will become more rational about this, and they'll accept that this is going to improve their own chances of survival. It's like choosing behind the veil of ignorance in Rawls's
So in terms of programming driverless cars, you would be in favour of them being programmed to just save the greatest number of people. So even if they have to swerve off the road to save 5 lives in the car and kill a pedestrian or a cyclist, your view is that the policy of programming should be just to save the greatest number of individuals, regardless of whether they're road users, innocent.
You'd have to mandate that, because if people are still choosing to buy their cars as they do today, they would choose to buy the cars that are going to save those in the car.
Do you think it would be right to mandate that?
If you could reliably increase the number of lives saved, yes.
My view, or my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that your views about animals and the values of lives and whether or not we can eat them has changed over time. I understand that there are certain contexts in which you might think this is okay. I was wondering what it was that changed your mind, or slowly changed your mind, about whether or not it's okay to eat certain animals.
Well, the main change that I've made from the first edition of Animal Liberation is in response to this argument that if animals have good lives, so they're not in factory farms, they're out in the fields, they're doing whatever is natural for their species, they're in the kind of social group that they can enjoy being part of. And if they're then killed without pain or suffering, preferably on the farm rather than being transported to slaughter, and if they would not have existed at all if it were not for some people purchasing the meat of animals who were previously reared and killed, reared in that way and killed, then it's hard to say how the animal is harmed, because by eating meat produced in that way, you provide the farmer with a reason for bringing more animals into existence, and those animals have good lives and are then killed prematurely, of course, because nobody likes to eat old animals. But still, they have good lives, which are better than no life at all. So I did shift my position after the first edition, where I'd argued that even so it was wrong to do that, and I became unconvinced with the arguments that I gave for saying that that was wrong. So that's the major change that I've made.
Does this mean that if we have reason to create these animals that will have good lives so that we can eat them, does this mean that you think it is better to reproduce as humans if we can guarantee that these children will have good lives than it is to not reproduce at all?
Yes, actually, I think you can say that, and I said it just 2 days ago when I was speaking in Korea, which, as you may know, has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. Fertility is now something like 0.7 children per woman, and Koreans are very seriously concerned about their nation dwindling, basically, and not really being able to maintain its place in the world. And so I was asked whether I thought that there was some sort of moral reason for having children, or I was asked more broadly than that, if there's anything I should say to couples who are thinking about having children or not having children. And I said something along those lines that, obviously it's a decision for couples or women to whether they want to have children or not, and I was not saying that they should be coerced into having children at all, but I think in their thinking about whether it is or is not good to have children, they should give some weight to the fact that Korea is a prosperous, well-ordered society. There's no reason to think that children born into Korea today, South Korea, of course I'm talking about, would not lead good lives, and that the fact that they can give rise to the existence of children who can lead good lives should be a factor in their decision. I didn't want to say more than that, but
not an obligation, but a good reason.
Yeah.
So, not only are you the world's most influential living philosopher, you're probably the world's most controversial philosopher, and you've been cancelled on many occasions, dating back to the 90s. I remember when I was doing my PhD with you at Monash, you were cancelled from a German conference, which seemed to me particularly ironic since I believe that your grandparents were involved in the Holocaust as Jewish victims. So you've also just recently established this Journal of Controversial Ideas. I mean, I wonder if you can share your views on freedom of speech, cancellation, and why you've decided to establish this journal.
Yes, so you're right. The term cancelled wasn't actually in use it was 1989, the first conference that my invitation to speak at was withdrawn from in Germany. And eventually I think the whole conference was cancelled, actually, because there was just so much controversy about it. And there were some other occasions when that occurred. And you're right, it was ironic because 3 of my 4 grandparents were murdered by the Nazis. But somehow the Germans had this idea that the Nazis had a so-called euthanasia program, which was not really a euthanasia program in the sense of being for the good of the individuals at all. It was a program to rid the Aryan people of, those who were considered a blot on their racial or genetic composition. So that was certainly something in the back of my mind when the cancel culture became more prominent in not just in Germany but in Western nations as a whole. And the spark for the Journal of Controversial Ideas wasn't mine. It came from Francesca Minerva, who published an article on abortion and infanticide, defending both of those in some circumstances, and received appalling hate mail, including death threats of the kind, you better watch your back when you go home because we know where you live, and also thought that she may have permanently, permanently wiped out her prospects of having an academic career because there was so much hostility to this. Fortunately, she does have an academic career still. But she floated the idea of a journal that would publish things that were controversial and that might not get published elsewhere, and where authors, if they wished, could publish under a pseudonym so that the kind of attacks that she had been subject to would not be possible. And then if they, if things calmed down and they were applying for a job and they wanted to take credit for an article in the journal that they were the author of, they would be able to do so. So it was her idea. She talked to me, she talked to Jeff McMahon, and the three of us agreed then to found the journal and to co-edit it. And I think the articles we published have shown that there is a need for a journal like that. There are many articles that did not get published, despite having gone through the peer review process and getting strongly positive reviews. But then the editors decided clearly on political grounds not to publish them. So we've published many of those articles.
Which do you think was the most interesting?
The most interesting articles we published?
Yeah, which is your favourite?
Actually, there's an article in the first issue that I really liked called Creation Science. Is that the exact word? That may not be the exact title, but it's essentially arguing that the denial of the idea that there are genetic differences in intelligence is equivalent to denial of the idea that that life has developed through evolution rather than through divine creation, and I thought that got us off to a good start. It made a very strong scientific case that the denial that differences between individuals have some genetic component is just so much flying in the face of facts.
Well, again, maybe you could just elaborate. A lot of people will be shocked by that today. And, you've been a staunch egalitarian. And so many people will see this as being eugenic or discriminatory. Could you tell us, how you can hold this scientific belief yet still be an egalitarian?
I think that there's a sharp distinction between looking at the facts, trying to get the best evidence, which essentially is what science is doing, and assess that evidence, and as objectively as you can try to say what the evidence points to, and what that implies in terms of how people ought to be treated, which is an ethical question, not a scientific one. So, yes, certainly you can be an egalitarian and say, look, there are differences, there are genetic differences between human beings, and they don't just relate to things like the kind of hair you have or your skin colour or your height, but they relate to various cognitive abilities. That doesn't mean that you say we ought to give less consideration to those who have less aptitude for cognitive tasks than others. On the contrary, I think you should clearly give equal consideration to the interests of people, irrespective of their cognitive abilities. But it may be relevant to questions about what kind of roles they have in terms of what jobs they're capable of doing. Those questions may clearly depend on cognitive abilities.
So we now have the potential to change the genetic makeup of future generations. We can already genetically select embryos for traits, not just disease traits, but also for IQ to some degree. And of course, in the future, we'll be able to gene edit. And you have this paper called the Genetic Supermarket, where I think you.
This is a great paper.
I think
shopping at the genetic supermarket.
I've read it many times.
Right.
You're against shopping in general. You have another book against shopping. In this
don't
case,
spend too much.
You're in favour of shopping.
Well,
but so tell us what's your view around then changing the genes if there are these genetic differences and you think that they're associated with disadvantages. Do you think we should be allowing people, encouraging people, compelling people to change the genes of the next generation?
Well, the first claim that I make in that is that this is an issue that we ought to be discussing. In fact, it's taken somewhat longer to come.
That's a very weak answer for you.
I said the
We need
first.
more discussion.
I wasn't.
That's like a chatbot. What do you think instead?
I wasn't going to stop at that point.
Maybe you're just thinking while you.
But that is the first thing that we haven't had enough discussion of this. And as you say, it's coming. I mean, you said we can already select at the embryonic stage for IQ. I'm not sure to what extent that's right. I mean, it's a polygenic trait, right? It's not like finding just one gene.
Yeah, you get polygenic scores now. And
Yeah.
it's not precisely, but you can, within a range, you can affect it. Now, how much you can affect it, people disagree, but there's no doubt. I mean, Genomic Prediction originally marketed their polygenic score to select out embryos in the low normal range, and they got pushback, so they moved the cutoff to just disease. But, that is already here. It will increase in power. And then, of course, you've got polygenic editing in the future.
So Genomic Prediction pulled back from doing that, but is there anything to stop another company saying, hey, there's a market here?
In fact, another one just recently came saying that they were going to offer
We're going
this.
to do that, right. So it is here, in other words,
It
what
is
you're
here,
saying.
but it's not going to have a massive effect. But it's the tip of the
But
iceberg.
increasingly, as we get better at the predictions, it will have a more effect, right? Because, I mean, I think parents will definitely want this. I also think I wrote a piece that I noticed when I got to Princeton, that in the student newspaper, the Daily Princetonian at that time, there were ads appearing for female students to donate their eggs for essentially, to people who, I guess, perhaps were not fertile, but they wanted eggs from people who had scholastic aptitude scores above, I can't remember, it was 1,300 or 1,400 anyway, some high end. And sometimes they refer to other characteristics, must be over this height, So there was clearly genetic selection that people were willing to pay, and the offers were, I think, $25,000, and this was in 20 years ago, so that's more than that now. So people are clearly willing to pay for having a child with a better chance of getting into Princeton or Harvard or Yale or one of those elite American universities. And so once you get companies offering this, I think people will be taking it up, and it will depend on how reliable the prediction is. But if it turns out to be reliable, then I think we'll get that. And then the question is, the ethical question is that a bad thing? Is this eugenics? And is this eugenics in a bad sense of the term? Because I think the term eugenics is used loosely and widely. And in fact, if you really are opposed to eugenics entirely, you ought to prohibit women having abortions based on prenatal testing, because if that isn't eugenics, I don't know why it isn't eugenics, but it so happens that the people who shout eugenics as a bad word also support abortion rights, as I do. So they haven't quite grappled with that fact that those two views are in contradiction with each other. I don't think it would be a bad thing, I have to say. It may take us some time to get used to it. There may be some things that we need to sort out. But if parents choose to have children with higher cognitive abilities, we have a lot of problems that are going to be assisted if we do have a lot of people with high cognitive abilities. So I would not oppose that.
So I'm particularly interested in the human enhancement question, which is the idea that, if we could improve these abilities, we should. And I was wondering if you think there's a presumption there that more is better, that higher is better, that increasing every capacity or function will guarantee an increase in well-being. But I do remember reading in your book, Practical Ethics, that it is not necessarily true that the more intelligence you have, the more well-being you have. So if your measurement is only happiness, then on what grounds should we enhance intelligence or other factors?
Well, I think it's not necessarily true that the more intelligence you have, the happier you will be. And of course, it isn't necessarily true that people with high levels of intelligence or other cognitive abilities are going to do good with them. Some of them may do terrible things with them. That's certainly possible. But I think that on balance, people with higher cognitive abilities are able to do more good. And so I'm optimistic enough to hope that they will do more good. So I think that's the utilitarian reason for trying to encourage people to develop their own cognitive abilities and those of their children.
Do you think then it's equally valuable to enhance some children who might go on to have higher cognitive abilities, as well as to provide the socioeconomic resources to those who already have the higher cognitive abilities but haven't had the opportunity to access them? Do you think there is no difference?
If the enhancing has the same effect, there's no real difference, right? So I don't think we've done enough in enhancing to know whether that's the case and how it works. But if it could be done safely and it had the same effect as, let's say, giving the children an absolutely first-class educational, an absolutely first-class education. And I think, everybody would say, yeah, well, it would be fantastic if the government could give everybody in society the best kind of education that there is available. So if other forms of enhancement had the same effect, then I don't see why we shouldn't do it.
So you won this Gruen Prize, which comes with $1 million, which I believe you donated to charity. So it's
Yes, that's
most
true.
prestigious prize. And I actually met Nicholas Gruen once, and we had lunch. And right at the end of the lunch, he said to me, he paid for lunch. And he said, I've got this book I'm going to give to my daughter when she's older, and I ask everyone I meet, I want one line that will be passed on to my daughter, and I went into this state of panic. But then I remembered this sort of one line that it's better to fail doing what you want to do than succeed doing what you don't want to do. But I'm wondering what the line was that you gave Nicholas Gruen for his little book.
I feel like
for
there's
his
an
daughter.
inside joke here.
or you can make up another line that you want to be remembered for.
I did get presented with a book. I did write something in it. I no longer remember with any reliability what I wrote in it. But I hope it was probably something along the lines of do the most good you can.
I would have thought it's if you can be happy, be happy. This is the
Well,
motto of the
but as a
utilitarian.
utilitarian, I mean, that's an
Sacrifice
And make
yourself
everyone else
at
happy.
all costs.
yeah, exactly. If you add the and make everybody else happy,
Maximise happiness.
and reduce suffering.
Missed opportunity there.
Yeah.
I give the floor to you, Peter. Is there anything you want to say to the billions of people that will be listening to this podcast?
Well, one thing I do want to say is I have my own podcast and I would like you to listen to it. It's called Lives Well Live. I do it with Kasia de Lazari-Rudek. I mentioned a co-author of a couple of books that I've written. And we discuss how to live well, which I think is along the lines, and how to help others live well, which is along the lines of what we've been talking about, with a different, exciting, stimulating guest each week. And you can find it wherever you get your podcasts.
To our listeners, I've checked the list. It includes Jane Goodall, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Noah Yuval Harari.
Yuval Harari, that's right. Yes,
Yes.
it does.
So
and
excellent.
many others.
This
Yeah.
podcast does support the other podcasts. But thank you for listening, and we'll see you next year.
Thanks for listening to our new podcast. Subscribe online and tune in every first of the month. In the meantime, listen to CBME and You and be savvy.